So Mad Max Fury Road, as you know, people have seen it. We've had some emails in which we'll get to in a moment. And fourth installment, part non-sequel, part reboot, sort of occupies a world similar to, alongside, sideways from 1979 Mad Max. You can either see it as a continuation or I was talking to Nigel Floyd about this, actually. I said, do we call it sequel, reboot? He said, well, I think it's like that thing in Star Trek, isn't it? When you kind of create an alternative universe that sort of seems to exist alongside it. Anyway, so Tom Hardy's Max Rokitansky, and at the beginning of the film, he is chased and imprisoned by the war boys of Immortan Joe, who is running the Citadel, keeping all the population completely under heel by withholding water from them, and he's turned himself into a sort of godlike figure. A bunch of stuff happens, but essentially, very early on, Max ends up making a run for the border alongside Charlize Theron's Imperator Furiosa, who is driving the war rig, who suddenly goes off-grid and is clearly making some kind of bid for freedom. She is carrying with her a cocktail of petrol and also a group of women known collectively as the Wives, who are escaping from Immortan Joe's breeding farm, essentially. And so Max is kind of teamed with them, and they're chasing their way. Where are they going to? In one of the very few moments of respite, there's on the brief sort of dialogue sections, we discover that they are heading for the legendary Green Place.
How do you know this place even exists?
I was born there.
So why'd you leave?
I didn't. I was taken as a child. Stolen.
You done this before?
Many times. Now that I drive a war rig, this is the best shot I'll ever have.
And them?
They're looking for hope.
What about you?
Redemption.
Now,
nice,
I have
nice strings.
Yeah, nice strings.
Nice strings.
I have to tell you that is an uncharacteristic moment of quiet dialogue in what is essentially a 2-hour chase movie. George Miller has talked about this, and I agree with this. He's talked about the ballet of action movies being somehow influenced by silent cinema. Actually, there being something pure about the story being told visually, being told non-verbally, about the action itself being the choreography, being the machine, being the engine that drives the film forward. And there is a certain purity involved in that. And I think it's very interesting that what Miller has chosen to do is to really follow that line as far as he can. So what you get is essentially, I was comparing this before, it's like that everything louder than everything else. It's like
Who said that?
Well, I think originally it's Deep Purple, and then it was picked up by Lemmy, and then Motorhead, and then Meatloaf made a thing. But it's a kind of, it was Richie Blackmore originally said it, and then Ian Gillan repeated it. But it's a phrase about, everything louder than everything else. And there was a phrase that occurred to me on more than one occasion whilst watching Mad Max Fury Road, not just because it was very loud in the screening that I saw it in. I don't have a problem with it being loud, but it was. But also because you had the feeling that everything was cranking, and you knew that what George Miller was doing was he was going, I'm going to keep going with this. I am going to absolutely, and it is quite insane. I mean, quite insane in an organised way, but it is quite insane, the level of action in Mad Max. And many people have been completely bowled over by this, have really been sort of, knocked out by the intensity of them. There's no question about the fact that the film has a physicality to it that is crunchy and that is kind of meaty, and you can feel those gears grinding, and you can feel the engines pumping, you can smell the oil. Also, there's been a lot of discussion about the fact that in the character Furiosa, we get with Charlize Theron, who's got this kind of Ripley Alien 3 era crop, and
nice.
And a sort of a mechanical hand, like a Terminator-like hand, that she is actually in many ways the centre of the action. And it's not just that she's a foil to Mad Max, but she's really the heroine. And going on, as is always the case with George Miller's films, there's this kind of interesting discussion about what happens in a post-apocalyptic society, and this is basically a sort of a hideous patriarchy facing up against some kind of alternative alternative matriarchy. So all that stuff is going on in the film, and it's barreling forward like this, and the cameras are sweeping forward. It's using this edge arm camera system, which enables them to run this camera car alongside the action with a 360-degree gyroscopic swoop. I mean, the thing with most Michael Bay movies is that you get the feeling of weightlessness, of airlessness, of lack of substance, of there not being any. But this is a very physical movie. I should also say I saw it in 2D. It was press screened in 2D because it was shot in 2D, and then the 3D has been put on afterwards. There was a discussion for a long time about whether they were going to shoot it in 3D, then it was going to be done as an animation, then they were talking about Akira as being. They ended up shooting it in 2D, and it was press screened significantly in 2D. There's been a lot of discussion on the internet about whether or not George Miller prefers the 2D version. He certainly said some things that implies that he did. I just thought this doesn't need to be, there's nothing, there is absolutely no way this needs stereoscopy, because watching it is like being run over whilst being shouted at, and then being run over again whilst being shouted at some more. And I don't say that necessarily as a criticism. However, there are problems. This one moment I was making this,
it's not without problems.
It's not without problems. That comparison in terms of the heavy metal bands and everything loud and everything else. There is actually one vehicle involved in the chase, because there's the war rig which is being chased by all these, firstly by the people from the Citadel, and then by the Bullet Town people, and then there's the thing with the weird people on stilts. It looks like Archaeos. Do you remember Archaeos? It looks like they escaped from a French circus and went feral in the outback.
They're the guys with the juggling chainsaws.
With the juggling chainsaws, yes. And you do half expect to see them and Lordy, the Finnish rock winners, because that's so. Anyway, so all of that stuff is going on, and it really is quite breathtakingly. There is several.
That's not a
when
word.
The cars. It's not a word, but that's the joy of radio. So I couldn't write that in a review, but I can say to you that it's and gear crunching. And however, two problems. The first one is, if you do that in a 90-minute exploitation movie, we can remember the first Mad Max was cheap as chips, and was essentially a Roger Corman movie. Stripped down. It had very little resources. It was a high concept in as much as it's an idea, and it is a revenge idea. This is the other, completely the other way. Huge, great big production. I mean, looks extraordinary, retina scorching visuals. But if you do it kind of like a 90-minute chase thing, Roger Corman famously, 85, 86 minutes and you're out. 2 hours, there is no question that it gets a bit exhausting. It's not a movie of light and shade. It's a movie of loud and very loud indeed. The second thing is, people have talked a lot about the feminism of the central character of Charlize Theron, but it's conflicted, because in the portrayal of the wives, they're very much seen like a kind of Vogue fashion shoot, and the kind of the wardrobe, which appears to be taken from 1 million years BC, with these sort of strange floatiness. So visually, although the narrative has this kind of feminist thread going through it, and it does, the visuals occasionally find themselves at odds with that, and the casting of Rosie Huntington-Whiteley sort of sets off alarm bells, because you think of Transformers Dark of the Moon and what Michael Bay did with Rosie Huntington-Whiteley in that film, which he basically cast her as as a sort of as a glamour model. It was just like she was glamorous to look at, but she didn't do anything else. So there is a weird kind of conflict at the heart of it as to exactly what its gender politics are. So my problems are that I could have done personally with more light and shade, and I'm not entirely won over by the great feminist action movie argument, although there are clearly elements of that in there. Many of them are down to the fact that Charlize Theron is terrific, with this kind of oil stripe across her forehead that makes her look like she just ran off the set of Apocalypto. Meanwhile, Tom Hardy is completely in keeping with the ethos of the film, because Tom Hardy is a muscular, physical, bodily, balletic actor. He's somebody who acts not with his eyes and with his mouth, but with his body. If you look at a film like Bronson, it's all to do with body language. And actually, weirdly enough, because of the way that Miller has constructed the movie, it's almost as if Hardy becomes part of the machinery. He becomes some kind of fleshy cog in that thumping, pounding machine. So overall, I mean, certainly in terms of what you could have expected from it, it's way better than you could have expected. However, it's not without flaws. And myself, I would have liked to have just downshifted a little bit, to have just taken your foot off the pedal a little bit. And as I said, I also think that there are some narrative things that don't quite work for me and that are slightly out of whack with the visuals. But what I like about it is I like the old school physicality of the visuals. I like the fact that it does feel like, I say, grinding cogs, gears, that smell of gasoline. You know, I've got an old car, and when you turn it on, it makes the smell that you can smell from the screen when you're watching Mad Max Fury Road. So, you know, generally good, but not quite the groundbreaking work of genius that so many people think it is. I think it's encouraging that people do, because I think what they're clicking into is, as I said, that purity of that almost silent cinema, balletic action thing. I just don't quite buy what I would have liked is more stripped down, more compact, tighter, more of a sprint, less of a slog.